Okay, let's move to the sugya. So again, as I mentioned before, I don't. Originally I thought maybe this would be 1 or 2 days, but really I'm happy to go whatever pace you want. I want to make sure that we, analyze things well, get the sources done. I'm thinking that after we finish this, the Rosh Hashanah sugya we should do this year is Rosh Hashanah that falls on Shabbos, considering Rosh Hashanah falls on Shabbos. And as one of my friends noted, this is probably the first year that any of us understand why Chazal thought that if you didn't know how to blow shofar, you might be going to an outdoor minyan and asking someone how to blow shofar and carrying it in public. Suddenly that Gemara makes sense. So it's probably worth addressing it at some point. But let's continue with Simcha. Okay, so last time we saw the position of Marsar Shalom, which is staking out one of the positions here in the Rishonim/Gaonim as to whether there is a mitzvah of Simcha on Yom Tov. And the position of Marsar Shalom is that indeed there is a mitzvah of Simcha. And what are his proofs? Remind me his proofs. He has 3 at least.
Right? But he cites Vasi.
His proofs. Marsar Shalom Gaon, he has proofs. The nafkaminas. Yeah, thanks. The Torah, the Nevi'im, right? And the Gemara, right? Meaning, Vayikra puts all the Chagim together, including Rosh Hashanah, all the Moedim together. Nehemiah, you have a conversation about whether there seems to be whether there's Simcha or not, and he goes as far as to claim that is the conversation between Nehemiah and the people, that the people who, or the reason Nehemiah has to tell people, send food, right? Send Mishloach Manot, essentially, right? Manot le'nachon lo, with food to people who didn't prepare before Rosh Hashanah, was because there were people who thought you should fast on Rosh Hashanah. Nehemiah thought they were wrong. So Nehemiah was now saying, all these people who were so from that they thought you should fast on Rosh Hashanah, they're wrong, so send them food. So they'll have food to eat, because that's the mitzvah. And related to that was the Gemara in Beitza, which invokes the pasuk in Nehemiah in its conversation, the mitzvah of Simchat Yom Tov. Right, those are his 3 central proofs. And what are the 2 nafkaminas for him are Tefillah, right? Moadim l'simcha, chagim uzmanim l'sason, which he thinks you should include. And the second is that he thinks it's prohibited to fast on Rosh Hashanah, right? That's what we saw. Okay. So now let's look at the second position. Now I'll just make a few introductory remarks that came up in the questions that you sent me by WhatsApp. In general, right, good to know the Rosh is immediately following the Gemara, and the Rosh normally follows the pagination of the Gemara. Right, so if you just keep turning after you finish the Masechta, right, the Dapim will continue and the Rosh will be right there. That's good to know. The Mordechai is harder to find. The Mordechai is way beyond that, towards the end of, depending on what you have, regulars or Oz V'Hadar, it's far down at the end of the Gemara, but somewhere there. Okay, so let's continue looking at the Rosh. Let me pull up the Rosh on the screen. Fine. So, we were up to, let's see. Okay, so we're up here. Let's just run through a few of the lines here, and then I'll ask you to read. But let's just summarize. So he notes that it wasn't just Marsar Shalom, right? He gives you a whole history. This apparently was a dispute that went on for the duration of the Gaonic period. So he quotes, V'gam Rabbeinu Shmuel ben Chafni, bar Rabbi Chafni, kadav shemenag b'shtei yeshivot, shemchal Rosh HaShana b'Shabbat, omrim moadim l'simcha, chagim uzmanim l'sason, et yom hazikaron hazeh zichron shua mikra kodesh. Right, the position of Shmuel ben Chafni, who's another Gaon, was that when they fall together on Shabbat, so you have the whole text, including moadim l'simcha, chagim uzmanim l'sason, but he thinks that you don't b'chol. Right? Now, I don't know exactly what motivates him there, right? Why he thinks that in Chol you would not say it. He seems to think that fundamentally there is a mitzvah of Simcha on Rosh Hashanah. For some reason, he doesn't think that has to be reflected in every possible tefillah that we have. I don't know why. I don't know if it's just he thinks in Simon B'Shtayim. I don't know exactly what he wants here. And then he quotes V'chein katav Rav Palti Gaon V'atitin lanu ba'ava mo'adin l'simcha chagim uzmanin l'sason V'Rav Hai katav Ein minhag lomar chagim uzmanin l'sason V'chein minhag pashut bizman hazeh b'chol ha'makomot. But then the Rosh tells you that, or I guess quoting the Rav Yah, that Rav Hai Gaon says it's not true. Rav Hai Gaon says that's not the minhag, and that's the minhag, as he says in all the places as far as he can say, as far as he can see. Uve Ashkenaz, uve Tzarfat, no again, Shalol Omar V'Asinu Rosh HaShana Yom Kippurim V'Shar Mekamot Omrim Oto. In France and Germany, they don't say V'Hasienu, right? That paragraph in Shemona Esrei that talks about all the Chagim. Other places they do. V'chein katav Ritzkei Utzal, and then you have this very strange minhag of the Ritzkei Ut quotes Shenahagu b'shtei yeshivot uvekulhu Bavel shemitpalin atzibor rak sheva brachot v'shatz right v'shleach tzibor yored v'omer teisha. Apparently, he had the position that Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot are only said by the Chazan, right, by the Shleach Tzibor, and therefore only the Shleach Tzibor says 9 brachot. The first 3, the last 3, and then Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. But as we know, most of the Amidot that we say during the year have how many brachot? Either, there are 2 options, right? Almost every 19 or 7, right? Our daily Amidah has 19. Shmona Esrei, which has Chasrei, right? 18, which is 19, fine. Which, whatever, is not Minhag Eretz Yisrael, but that was Minhag Bavel that we follow. It's not that way in the Yerushalmi. And on all the other Amidot we have are 7. Musaf is 7. The only exception is Musaf on Rosh HaShana, which has 9. And everything else is 7. The 3 first, the 3 last, and the middle bracha. But the Ritzkei Ut says that the minhag by him in Bavel was 9 for the Chazan, 7 for everybody else. I assume the middle was some sort of Birkat Hayom, right? Mekadesh, right? Yom HaZikaron, right? Something like that. Yom HaZikaron, Yom Tshuvah, some girsa like that, with no Malchiot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. V'hevi tshuvat harbe l'rishonim l'Rav Amram l'Rav Nachshonai shamru me'olam lo etbal tzibur Shana el Hashem. And then he quotes a whole bunch of the Gaonim who have this, right? So you see that this discussion was going on a lot in the Gaonic period. It's not actually surprising. If you go through the Gaonic Tshuvot, you'll see that a lot of the Gaonic Tshuvot are about the Nusach of Tefillah, right? Are about how you're supposed to daven, because they didn't have, Sidurim, so they would send letters to the Gaonim, and the Gaonim would say, B'shtei Shivot, right? In Surah and Pumbedita, this is the custom. Okay, and now he gets to the second of his nafkaminot, right? Nafkaminot, technically, right? Which is fasting. Okay, who wants to pick up from here? Ulahitanot. Oh, come on! Someone do it. It's hard for me to stare at you guiltily on Zoom.
Okay, I can do it.
Wait, Gavi, you raised your hand.
Oh, Gavi, go first.
Okay. Yeah, Gavi, you want to read?
Sure.
Okay, go.
Ulahitanot b'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh HaShana u'v'shabbat sheben Rosh HaShana l'Yom HaKippurim. So fasting on the 2 days of Rosh Hashanah and on Shabbat Yeshua. Hachi Amar Rav Nachshonai Gaon. Right, so this is what Rav Nachshonai Gaon said. B'yom tov rishon shel Rosh Hashanah Ev shar l'shiv bo b'ta'ani. So on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, you're not allowed to fast. Mishum de midoraita, because it's a doraita yom tov. Aval yom tov shenu v'shabbat late behu koshya, but on the second day of Rosh Hashanah and on Shabbat, then there's no problem. Mishum dasar yomei inun mishonin
mikol yom Hashanah. So there's no problem. Why? Because these days are
different from the rest of the year.
Very good. The fichach.
In what way does it not still have the same din of Shabbos that.
Oh, good. So 1 second. Just finish the one more line, and then I'll take it. Lefichach noagin rabotenu leishev behen v'taniyot ben b'chol ben v'shabbat. Okay, good. Okay, let's pick this apart here. Rav Netrunai Gaon says you cannot fast on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, but you can on Shabbat, and you can on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. What is the problem with this?
What's the difference between? I mean, when are you ever allowed to fast on Shabbos? I guess first, and then also like, why are we making a distinguishment between the first and second day of Rosh Hashanah?
Okay, good. So, who asked this question right away? Right, the Rosh. Right, the Rosh is right. Udvarav tmuhin. I don't know what he's talking about. Right, what's tamua? It's shocking. Right, meaning I don't know what he's talking about. Sha'asar litanot b'yom tov rishon shel Rosh Hashanah v'hiter litanot b'Shabbat. I don't get it. Like, either you can or you can't. V'nir'eh divrei Rav Hai shekatov litanot b'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah anu roim she'afeu shelo litanot. And therefore the Rosh says, I just follow Rav Hai Gaon, who says, don't fast. Shekach amru parnasei Yisrael rishonim liYisrael b'Rosh Hashanah echlu ma'adanim ushtu mamtakim ki kadosh hayom. He said, as the original leaders of Klal Yisrael said, party on Rosh Hashanah. Who's the original leader?
Nehemiah.
Thank you. That was Nehemiah. Right? He's quoting the pasuk from Nehemiah. So I don't know what you're talking about. Okay, good. So let's start with the easier position to understand. The Rosh quotes Rav Hai, and he says, don't fast. Why can't you fast? Why can't you? Because there's a mitzvah simcha, presumably, right? It's Yom Tov. Why should you be allowed to fast? So Rav Hai says, don't fast. Very good. Rav Netrunai has a very bizarre position. Now let's try to analyze Rav Netrunai. Rav Netrunai says, so what position would you easily have understood, right? The first position that is understandable is you can't fast. Why? Because there's a mitzvah of simcha. What other position could you easily conceptually understand?
You would just allow for all fasting?
Good, right? The other conceptual position that's easy here would be to say, you can fast because there's no mitzvah of simcha. Simcha is overwhelmed by the mehadin, something like that, and therefore you're allowed to fast on Shabbat, you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov, you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov Rishon, you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov Sheni. Right? That would have been the opposite extreme. Anyone want to try to defend Rav Netrunai Gaon that you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov Sheni but not on Yom Tov Rishon, and you're allowed to fast on Shabbat, just not Yom Tov Rishon? Anyone want to?
I can see the distinction between Yom Tov Rishon and Yom Tov Sheni. Maybe because, there is some ambiguity about what the status of Yom Tov Sheni is. So you can say that it's not on the same level, and so that you can fast.
Right, it's 100%. It's only derabanan. But there's something more. I want to tease this out with you, right? Meaning, formally, what does he say? You can't fast on Yom Tov Rishon because it's Yom Tov D'Oraita. You can fast on Yom Tov Sheni because it's only derabanan. So you could just say it's D'Oraita D'Rabbanan, but you'd be missing something very, very important in Rav Netrunai Gaon, which is, there's something weird going on here, which is, sure, it's easier as things go to override Yom Tov Sheni. There are a lot of kula related to Yom Tov Sheni. Right? So for example, when it comes to Yom Tov Sheni, if there's a chole, you're allowed, right? If there's a chole, you don't even have to try to get a guy, you can do it yourself. Right, there's certain kula when it comes to Yom Tov Sheni. You're allowed to bury someone on Yom Tov Sheni. Nasuk, right? There are other. What's weird about this exception? What's weird about the exception that you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov Sheni? What should strike you as very, very odd in Rav Netrunai Gaon?
Because fasting isn't necessarily a spiritual necessity. You typically think of fasting as like a requirement or. But not
very good.
So if we're saying that simcha is a requirement, then it should be the same for both days, and like
not just for one.
Exactly, right? Meaning, it's very weird. It's one thing to say, look, Yom Tov Sheni is derabanan, so look, in general, on Shabbat and Yom Tov, there are leniencies for a sick person. On Shabbat, which is the most chamur, we're the most stringent. Yom Tov, less. Yom Tov Sheni, which is derabanan, so Chazal choose to waive most of the Yisurim for a Choleh. But that keeps in the theme of Shabbat and Yom Tov, because Shabbat and Yom Tov, at the end of the day, Pikuach Nefesh is Doche Shabbat, it's Doche Yom Tov. So, derabanan Yom Tov, so you'll be even more lenient. But that follows a logical trajectory. If we say you're allowed to bury someone on Yom Tov Sheni, that makes sense, because you'll say, look, there's a mitzvah of Kavod HaMeit. It's not strong enough to overwhelm the Deoraita, but it's enough to overwhelm the Derabanan. Fine. But what does this even mean? Meaning, either fasting is in consonance with the theme of Rosh Hashanah, in which case Rosh Hashanah should be a fast day, or it's anathema to the theme of Rosh Hashanah, in which case, even if it's allowed, technically, it could be allowed, we wouldn't encourage it, because why would you encourage it? It goes against the theme of Rosh Hashanah. What does Reb Netrunai seem to be saying by saying it's mutter on Yom Tov Sheni, but it's not Yom Tov Rishon? What does he have to be saying? Right, he has to be saying something very fascinating conceptually, which is what?
There's no Simcha on Yom Tov Sheni as much as Yom Tov
Rishon. So either he's mechadesh that Yom Tov Sheni doesn't have Simcha, which would be a wild claim, right? That we don't treat Yom Tov Sheni as Yom Tov Rishon for these purposes. That would be wild. He could say it, but it would be wild, right? What else might he be saying?
Perhaps we're saying that the idea of Simcha on the second day could be defeated if you have some other overriding reason to fast.
Yes, but I want to push you just a little bit farther. If you read his language carefully, according to Reb Netrunai Gaon, do you think that in theory he thinks fasting is conceptually in line with the themes of Rosh Hashanah, such that it would make sense to fast on the first day? What do you think? He says it's usher, but do you think he thinks it's thematically against Rosh Hashanah? Or look back at his language. Right? B'Yom Tov Rishon Shel Rosh Hashanah I Efshar Leishev Bo B'Ta'anit Mishum Midoraitahu. On the first day you can't do it because it's Deoraita. But what does that, almost rhetorically, what does it sound like Reb Netrunai wants?
It sounds like he's saying the second day is not actually a chag, but the first day is.
Yeah, but it's even more than that. What is he? Do you think Reb Netrunai wants you to be able to fast on Yom Tov Rishon? Not like whether it's mutter. Do you think that at some level he thinks that's that it would make sense?
He says EF-shar, like to say it's not possible.
Yeah, but
if it was possible.
Yeah, exactly. I think that we can only understand Reb Netrunai the following way. Reb Netrunai, it's very weird. In general, we only say that Yom Tov Sheni overrides something that we think, again, like the Chola case. We think that it makes sense on Shabbat, on Yom Tov Rishon, Yom Tov Sheni, that there should be circumstances in which you can violate Chag or Shabbat for a sick person. The exact parameters are different. Right? Shabbat has higher standards, Yom Tov Sheni obviously has basically no standards. It sounds like Reb Netrunai Gaon is saying, look, it's not that the first day of Rosh Hashanah is, raucously joyous and fasting makes no sense, and the second day is solemn and it makes sense to fast. It sounds like what he's saying is that Rosh Hashanah is a complicated day. There is simcha to it, and there's also awe. There's also fear. And that thematically fits with fasting. And therefore he's saying, look, on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, there's a mitzvah deoraita of simcha, and therefore that has to, in practice, overpower the fear, trepidation theme which might have manifested itself in fasting. But in Yom Tov Sheni, both themes are there. But because the mitzvah of Simcha is less, because only the Rabbanan, but that theme of fear always coexisted in Rosh Hashanah, so it can overpower it and allow you to fast on Yom Tov Sheni. Now the truth is, Shabbat you're going to have to explain also, but Shabbat, is complicated, but there doesn't seem to be a pure mitzvah of Simcha on Shabbat either. There's this mitzvah of Oneg, which is not quite identical to Yom Tov. Okay, I see two raised hands. Who is raising their hand? Just talk. The Zoom raising the hand. Yeah, go, Adam. Okay, now I see your hand. Go.
So Ezra and I, it was very hard for us to hear when we were outside because of all the cars. So now we're lost on what's going on. Do you think you could give us a quick recap?
Sure.
So we could jump back in?
Sure, no problem.
Thank you.
Right, so there are two, what I would think, conceptually neat positions. Right? One is the position that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Tov with Simcha, and therefore you don't fast. Period. End of story. Done. Which is Rav Hai Gaon. The other logical position would have been all the way at the other extreme, which would have been, no, Rosh Hashanah is not a Yom Tov, there's no mitzvah of Simcha, and therefore it's really a Yom Hadin, it's really a day of fear and awe and trembling, so fasting is totally in consonance with the themes of Rosh Hashanah. That would make sense. Rav Nachman Gaon gives this weird compromise, which is, you're allowed to fast in Yom Tov Sheni, because it's only Derabanan and not Yom Tov Rishon. Now, what we were trying to do is understand Rav Nachman. Now, you could say that, well, look, it's just Derabanan, who cares, so fast. But that seems weird, because in general, we assume that Yom Tov Sheni, the leniencies on Yom Tov Sheni are only things that conceptually make sense with Yom Tov. It's just that when it's biblical, you can't do it. So, it's always valuable to respect the dead, but on Yom Tov Rishon, the value of Yom Tov overpowers the value of burying the dead. On Yom Tov Sheni, we reverse it. But you would think that either Rosh Hashanah is a happy day, in which case both the Oraisa version of it on day one and the Derabanan version of day two should require celebration rather than fasting, or it's not a holiday like that. It's a day of solemnity, and therefore fasting is completely on point for day one and day two. To split between them, what I think you need to say is that Rosh Hashanah is a complex day. It has elements of simcha and elements of fear, and therefore, at some level, it always makes sense to both party and fast on Rosh Hashanah, because each of those express a different theme inherent in Rosh Hashanah. And if you have that type of conceptual view, so then Reb Nachman can make sense. Because you can say, look, it's a complex day. On day one, when the simcha is biblical, so simcha has to overpower the yira that might manifest itself in fasting. But on day two, where the simcha is lessened because it's only derabanan, the other theme, which is ever present even on the first day, can overpower the obligation of simcha and allow you to fast. And then Reb Nachman, as weird as it is, might actually make sense. Okay, I think that's the way you have to understand Reb Nachman. Yeah, Yonatan.
Hang on,
But you muted yourself.
So, with the second day, when it's Derabanan, we say that the Simcha aspect, because it's Derabanan, doesn't overpower the fear aspect, and therefore we can't fast on the second day. But why does the first day being Deraisa, why does the Deraisa aspect overpower the fear?
Good, right? So as I said, this is not glut in any way, shape, or form. It's not smooth. It's weird. Meaning, Reb Nachman is still weird. Because at the end of the day, you would say, look, Yom Tov Sheni should be a carbon copy of Yom Tov Rishon, just on a derabanan level. And therefore, you're right. The smoother positions, and no one denies this, the smoother positions are either to take the all or nothing. Either there is simcha and you can never fast, or there's no simcha and you can always fast. The compromise position, no matter how you cut it, is weird, because in the end of the day, it's mechudash to say that there's a duality, right? That Rosh Hashanah has a dual nature, and when the Simcha is D'Oraita, one element is more manifest, and when it's D'Rabbanan, the other one is more manifest, or is allowed to be manifest if you want it. You're right, it's weird. But that's still the only way I can explain Rav Netrunai. I don't know, right? It's weird. I agree with you that even Lamaskana, it's strange because it's still smoother to say that conceptually Yom Tov Sheni is just a carbon copy on a D'Rabbanan level of Yom Tov Rishon. You're right, 100% you're right, right? But seemingly, again, maybe you have to push Rav Netrunai even farther, which is to say he really thinks, meaning given his... If he had been in a vacuum, he would have told you Rosh Hashanah should be a fast day, day 1 and day 2, right? It's almost as if like he has to admit that the sources don't support him. So like, what can I do? I thought that Rosh Hashanah was a day of fear. It happens to be the sources imply that it's a Simcha. So fine, for the D'Oraisa, I'll give in. But you can't prove to me that the second day is the same, so I'll tell you what I would have thought a priori, right? I'll tell you what I would have said pre-evidence. But it's weird, right? It's clear to me that Rav Netrunai, personally, believed, like, intuitively, he felt Rosh Hashanah should be a day of fear. It's just that he felt overwhelmed by the evidence. So as soon as he could find a petach, right, he could find some sort of excuse to allow the fear element to come in, he just let it go. But you're right, conceptually, it remains a weird position. That's why the Rush jumps on him. Okay. I gave you the Mordechai as well, if you want to look at it for a second, and we'll try to get some language here. But then I want to come back and really sort of polish off the conceptual question here. So the Mordechai also records this a discussion of the Gaonim, right? Nish'al Rabbeinu Nachshon Gaon, Ma'u litanot b'Rosh Hashanah, v'heshid b'Rosh Hashanah asur litanot. And someone asked me, I don't remember who asked me that chapter, I think it was Yehonatan, right? Rav Nachshon Gaon is so convinced that Rosh Hashanah is a Yom Tov, he just throws the book, or all the books, at the person who asked the question. He says, obviously it's a Yom Tov, you can't fast. How do I know? Bein mi divrei Torah, bein mi divrei Kabbalah, bein mi Braita, bein mi Talmuda. It's in the Torah, it's in the Nevi'im, it's in the Tanaitic literature and the Amoraic literature. Literally everything, right? If you think that Rosh Hashanah is not a holiday, you've missed every piece of Torah literature ever written. Right? That's Rav Nachshon says. He says, mi divrei Torah minayin. What's the proof from the Chumash? Lefishu kalulim shar moadot, because it's in the parsha of the moadot. Vayikra perak of Gimel. Uktiv be mikra kodesh. Vidarshinan b'sifra v'sifrei, and it says in Tanaitic literature, kadshuhu b'ma'achal. Right? Well, sorry, we should stop here. What is the sifra? What is the sifrei? This is something you should know for life. He calls it a braita, but what is it? Sifrei and Sifra are both what genre?
It's a Tanaitic, what's it called?
Midrash Halacha.
Midrash Halacha.
Very good. Yes, Gavi is 100% correct. Right, Sifrei and Sifra are both Tanaitic, meaning they're the same, they're contemporaneous with the Mishnah. They are Midrash Halacha, right? They're halachic exegesis of the Psukim. Sifra is on Vayikra, also known as Torat Kohanim. Sifrei is on Bamidbar and Dvarim. And on Shmot, which Midrash Halacha do we have? Gavi, do you remember?
Tanchuma?
No, Tanchuma is a Midrash Haggadah. It's a Gadik Midrash.
Torat Kohanim.
That's Vayikra. So Shmot, we have two. Mechilta, very good. We have Mechilta de Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. We have the two Mechiltas. Right, the Mechilta is a Midrash Halacha. Right, Mechilta Rabbi Ishmael, Mechilta Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So v'darshinan b'sifra u'v'sifrei kadshuhu b'ma'achal v'mishteh v'ksut nikiyah. Sanctify Rosh Hashanah with food and drink and clothing. V'chein perish Rashi Parshat Emor El Kohanim. I assume that's the Mordechai jumping in and not Rav Nachshon Gaon, because Rav Nachshon Gaon is before Rashi. Umikra Kodesh Yom Kippurim B'ksut Nikiyah, etc. Skipping down, V'od, the Rosh Hashanah Ikri Chag, Kechol HaMoadim. It is a Chag. Proof, B'kesel Yom Chagenu, the pasuk in Tehillim Pei Aleph. And then, Midivrei Kabbalah. What's Kabbalah here? He means Ktuvim. His proof is Ezra. Right? And he notes, is Lo B'Simchat Binyan Beit HaMikdash. They're not celebrating the Beit HaMikdash, they're celebrating Rosh Hashanah. And he notes, then he goes to basically all the details there, that Chanukah Abayit they had already done in Adar. So obviously they're celebrating Rosh Hashanah and not something else. Then he quotes a Yerushalmi, and he quotes our Gemara, right? He just goes on and on and on. And he quotes the Yerushalmi here, which says, Reb Chama bar Chanina v'Rav Avin bar Oshia Omer Chadam Re'ezu Umak Umazo. What nation is like the Jews? B'nahuk shebe'olam Adam she'odeh she'ish lo din. Normally, when you go to court, what do? Lovei shcharim, you're sad, you're scared, so you put on serious clothing. Right? Umigadel zkeino, you let your beard grow out. She'eni yodeh yotzei dino. Aval Yisrael einam kein. Lovshim levanim umitaftim. Livanim umegalchin zikanam, right? We dress up, we party, right? Ochlin shotin smechem yodim bakadosh baruch hu sheyas lem nes, because we know that God will forgive us. Harei min haTalmud she'asur letanot Rosh HaShana v'od mishtei tamim asur letanot chadash shel nikra asar yimei ta'anit. And he says, besides, these aren't the 10 days of ta'anit, el yimei tshuva v'hol v'nikra tzom lama yesh lanu latzum. If it's not a fast day, don't fast. Va'od lefichach technu chacham ledanu arba yom lefnei Rosh Hashanah keneged arba yamim shel Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim shochlim behem. And he says, you know what? And this is the most fascinating. What does he say? He says, if you had stopped before this line, what would you have said? According to Rav Nachshon, as quoted in the Mordechai, is Rosh Hashanah a full-out holiday? Yes, except then he pulls a fascinating move and he says, not really. It does have an element of tshuva which requires fasting. But instead of the compromise position of Reb Nachshon, he has a different compromise, which is that he quotes a different minhag gaonim that, let's see if you can figure out these lines, the end of the Mordechai. Va'od lefichach tiknu chachamim lihitanot arba yamim lifnei Rosh Hashanah keneged arba yamim shemei Rosh Hashanah liyom kippurim sheochlim bahem. Ve'elu hein shnei yamim shel Rosh Hashanah v'Shabbat beintayim ve'erev Yom Kippur. He pulls a fascinating move and he says, don't think that I don't recognize that there's not another element that exists on Rosh Hashanah. There is. But what do we do about it? We don't fast on Rosh Hashanah. We don't even fast on Rosh Hashanah on Yom Sheni. What do?
We fast the 4 days before Rosh Hashanah.
Very good. There was a minhag in his time to fast the 4 days before Rosh Hashanah, to be yotzei the 4 days of the Aseret Yimei Tshuva when we're not allowed to fast, which is Rosh Hashanah 1, Rosh Hashanah 2, Shabbat, right? Shabbat Tshuva, and Erev Yom Kippur, where there's a mitzvah d'oraita to eat. So it sounds like until you get to the very end that Rav Nachshon thinks that Rosh Hashanah is a pure Yom Tov. But then what does he tell you, the last line? That he also believes that Rosh Hashanah has a dual identity. But instead of the weird compromise of Reb Nachshon Gaon, that you fast on Yom Tov Sheni, not Yom Tov Rishon, he says what you do is, you, so to speak, isolate the two elements of Rosh Hashanah. The happy elements you manifest on Rosh Hashanah itself, and the scary elements to sort of pay heed, to give credit to the scary parts of it. You do that pre-Rosh Hashanah in a symbolic fast that represents Rosh Hashanah. Yeah, Yonatan, go.
Okay, yeah, so what does it say about that the people in general, they migdal zakenim, they upraise their elders, but by the Jews it says chotech, I think it's chotech zakenim, that we
shave.
It was
we shave.
We shave our zakenim. What does that mean? Like, what's the difference?
Well, when someone goes to court,
it seems negative. It seems negative for the Jews and more positive for the people in general. That they upraise their elders, but we shave down our elders.
Oh, no. Megadlins get... No, not elders. Their beard. Sorry, beard. Zaken is their beard.
Oh, okay.
No, sorry. They let themselves, like, their hair grow out, their beards grow out, they look unkempt because they're terrified. And we get a nice shave before Rosh Hashanah.
But don't our rabbis nowadays, a lot of them don't like to shave?
Yeah. Great for... Okay, let's take an aside for a minute, okay? this is a good place to point out that clearly Chazal believed that you were allowed to cut your beard, right? You were allowed to cut your beard. The notion that traditionally Jews had long beards is not so grounded historically. And maybe Gavi remembers this from last year, or maybe Yuri remembers it. I mentioned last year. In Tanakh, the best evidence that we have is, what did the beards of the Jewish people look like? They had beards, but what did they look like?
5 corners?
Oh, yes, thank you. That's like every beard. But how long were they? Oh, I stumped you. That's good. They were short beards. And I'll give you 2 proofs. One is from Sefer Shmuel, when David sends some of his men to Ammon, I think, right? The king thinks that they are traitors. So what does he do to humiliate them?
He cuts off their beards.
He cuts half their beard off, right? Half their beard, like this, right? Half their face, so that they'll look ridiculous. And what do they say to David? We don't want to have to show ourselves in public until it grows back, right? So he gives them a little bit of time. Except, how long does it take if you cut off, you have a long beard, right? A long rabbinic beard that goes down to your toes. How long does it take for half of it to grow back?
Half your life.
Yeah, it takes years and years and years. But if you have a short beard, how long does it take?
Months.
Depends how fast your beard grows. If it's me, a week, right? Meaning, if I shave before yeshiva, I'll have I have a 5 o'clock shadow by the time I leave at 1. It's like, it depends who you are. The second proof is we actually have pictures, not photographs, obviously, but we have pictures from the time of Tanakh on the Mesha stele, which is a picture made of kings of a battle between, I think it's the Plishtim, and the Jews, and on it you see 2 different nations. And there are people there on long rabbinic beards, except they are all Plishti. They're all Philistines. And the Jews all have short beards. That's just what we have. I can try to find it quickly. Let's see if I can find it. The Mesha stele. It's one of the other steels. If I can't find it, then I will give up. No, that's not the one I want. Okay, I'll have to find it. I'll send it to you later. I saw it when I went to the British Museum 2 years ago. You can see these in person. Okay. Anyways, close that parentheses. But yes, there you go, Andrew. It's not true that rabbis always had long beards. And, as you can tell, I have no beard, except for a 5 o'clock shadow. And, meaning Mori Varabi, Rav Lichtenstein did not have a beard. Rosenzweig still doesn't have a beard, right? But okay, if I'm not rabbinic, that's totally fine with me. I don't care so. I don't care so much. It really doesn't bother me.
Rabbi, how does fasting for 4 days in a row practically work?
I have no idea. I assume they fasted during the day and not at night, but I don't know. I honestly don't know. It's very dangerous to fast 4 days, right? The Gemara elsewhere says the reason we don't fast 2 days Yom Kippur is because of the danger, right? So, and in fact, we even have the Radbaz quotes a tshuva that one of the Balei Tosfot, who was a chassid, insisted, even though his doctor told him not to fast 2 days on Yom Kippur, and he died. Right, just to get the point across that this is a very bad idea. So I assume it's like a day fast and not night, like Ramadan or something. I'm not exactly sure. Okay.
Those 4 days correspond to the way that Ashkenazis do.
Yeah, I assume those are related. Yeah, I'm going to assume that those are somehow related. I assume that's why. I assume that's related to the minimum of slichot being 4 days. I assume those minhagim are overlapping. I don't know, but I'm going to assume that's true. Okay, so let us try to summarize what we've seen, okay? So we've seen the Rosh, Rav Hai Gaon, they're very easy. Rosh Hashanah is Pshuto Kamashmao, Yom Tov with Simcha, everything, period, end of story. That's how they understand Vayikra, Nehemia, Beitza, Rosh Hashanah, all those so good. Easy. The other logical position would be that no, it's not a Yom Tov at all, there's no Simcha. We don't really see anybody saying that. Instead, what we see are compromise positions which recognize the complexity that it's Simcha mixed. One compromise position is Reb Nechshonai Gaon, which is you can fast first day and not second day, which we suggested means that the fear and Simcha element always exist, but you can't actually override the mitzvah Simcha Yom Tov, but on the second day I can. Or, look, they coexist, but it can't manifest itself as fasting on Rosh Hashanah itself, but you do need to find a way to express that element, hence this minhag to fast 4 days before Rosh Hashanah. Now, I would think that this model, right, these more hybrid models, are, if you remember, when we originally started with that Gemara, we noted, what exactly is the response of God? Right? When God says, it's okay that they don't say Hallel. Right? So we said what you could read as a total rejection of Simcha, but we've seen that basically nobody takes that position. Right? But what we have seen is that the majority, right, many of the Rishonim do believe that God's response, so to speak, if we want to put it back to that Gemara, is that, yeah, Rosh Hashanah is a hybrid day. And therefore, it can have a dual identity. It can have Simcha, but also require some nod to the solemnity. What's clear in the Gemara is that we don't say Hallel, but what you see is the possibility that maybe you need to do a fast on Yom Tov Sheni, or you need to do a fast in advance to remind yourself that the second element exists. There is another possibility, which is, of course, to say that you don't really believe that it's a Yom Tov at all with a mitzvah of Simcha. It's something else, and it's specifically that something else which allows for the hybrid identity. And here we have to go back to the Psukim, because it's possible to say that that Rosh Hashanah is not a Yom Tov, a Chag with Simcha. What do we know that it definitely is?
A Chag?
We don't know it's a Chag. Right, that's the point. We don't know it's a Chag. What do we know that it is? If you want to be super careful from the Psukim in Vayikra, what do we know it is? We don't know it's a Chag. What? A Moed. A Mikra Kodesh. It's possible that the reason Rosh Hashanah has a hybrid identity, right, we've seen, the Rosh thinks that it's straight up a Chag. No questions asked. But it's possible that the other Shtita that are trying to find a compromise, the reason they're looking for a compromise is because they say, look, it has happy elements undeniably because it's a moed. But the reason that it doesn't manifest itself in the exact same way as every other Chag, and maybe you're allowed to fast on Yom Tov Sheni, or maybe even though you're not allowed to fast, you have to nod towards the fact that really you should be fasting, or the way Yehonadan had said it, is maybe it is something, but there's a reality of Sifrei Chaim v'Sifrei Meitim Ptuchim Lefanav that creates a dual identity. Maybe that's only possible because Rosh Hashanah is a happy day, but not a Chag. It's a Moed. And a Moed might be, right, not as joyous as a Chag because it might have the same way. What's another day that's like that?
Shabbos.
Shabbos. Very good. Right? And Shabbos, according to most Shitot, is a Moed and therefore has a mitzvah of Oneg, but doesn't have a mitzvah of Simcha. Right? And that's why, to give you a nafkamina, there are some Rishonim who think that on Yom Tov you need to have Basar v'Yayin. Why? Because there's a mitzvah of Simcha. And what do you need to have on Shabbat? Whatever you enjoy. Right? Because the nature of the enjoyment on Shabbat, which is a Moed but not a Chag, is not as objective and overwhelming. It exists and needs some expression, but it's not like Chag, which requires a more formal expression of Simcha. And it could be that the Shitot who think that you're allowed to fast, or that you should be fasting, think that it's not a Chag, but it is a Moed. And that's how they would respond to Vayikra Chav Gimel. They would say, no, Rosh Hashanah is not a Chag. It's a Mikra Kodesh. It's a Moed, which is a lesser holiday. So it deserves some sort of celebration, but not identical to a Chag. And they could, on the Nehemiah point, they could say, if you remember, right, the Mordechai spends a lot of time saying that maybe the Simcha was not about Rosh Hashanah per se, it was about this Rosh Hashanah. Right? It was about the first Rosh Hashanah back in the Beit HaMikdash or something like that. Right? It could be that they're saying normally it doesn't have real joy, but that year it did, or something like that. Right? And if we look quickly, because I think it's worth wrapping this up and not doing it, spending another day, unless you're dying to. Is you'll see that this sort of compromise position, I think, is actually the one that makes it into halacha. Is not the unmitigated joy position, but is this compromise position. So if you look, for example, in Shulchan Aruch says, Ochlim v'shotim u'shmeichim ve'ein mitanin b'Rosh Hashanah. You eat and you're joyous on Rosh Hashanah, and you can't fast. But then v'lo b'Shabbat Shuvah, not on Shabbat Shuvah either. But then what does he say? Amnam lo yochlu kol siv'am. But don't eat don't eat to the point of satiation. Leman lo yikalu rosham, so you don't become frivolous. V'tiyeh yirat Hashem al pneim, and instead you'll have the fear of God on your face. What is he saying? He paskins that you can't fast. But does the Shulchan Aruch seem to paskin that it's a straight up chag with the full simcha? What do you think? If you read Shulchan Aruch, what would you think? No, right? He seems to take a compromise position. And I think in order to have that compromise position, you have to either say it's a simcha, which has a second tier which you have to respect, or that no, it's really a moed, right? It's not identical to other Yamim Tovim, it's a moed. So you do have to eat and enjoy, but on Pesach I would never tell you to minimize joy because it's a full out chag. Rosh Hashanah is a moed, and which other day does he equate with it? Shabbat. Right? And I think that Shulchan Aruch might be taking this middle position, which is Shabbat and Rosh Hashanah are both moadim. They have a certain level of joy, but they're not chagim, and therefore the joy isn't unmitigated. And therefore there's more room to play with the exact manifestations of joy on Rosh Hashanah, on Shabbat Shuvah. Yeah, Yehonatan, or someone in that room is raising your hand. Yeah.
Yeah. If you were to follow the Shulchan Aruch and limit the joy you have, but still have that joy, wouldn't you not really be fulfilling the joy part because you're limiting it?
And that's
both at the same time.
Right, and that's why I think, and that's why I said you could read Shulchan Aruch in two ways. One is that there's pure simcha, but because the books of life and death are open, you need to do something to remind yourself of that. That I find weird, because if there's a mitzvah of simcha, there's a mitzvah of simcha. And that's why I tend to think that the Shulchan Aruch actually reflects a similar tradition to Rav Netrunai or Rav Nachshon Gaon, which is maybe it's not really simcha. It's the mitzvah of moed, which is a certain level of joy, but it's not the unadulterated joy that's supposed to manifest itself on Yom Tov. And when you're dealing with a lower level joy, then there's room to say rejoice, but in a staid fashion, right? With a little bit of restraint. And that's why I tend to think that Shulchan Aruch thinks that Rosh Hashanah is a moed, but not a full out chag. It's a holiday, but it's not a celebratory day, right? It requires a certain level of, and I think to support that, right, you get this very strange halacha and halacha bet, which is yesh mikomot shekabala biadam shekol mi sheragil etanot Rosh Hashanah. Right, if he thought it was Yom Tov, he would say, you have to fast. You're not allowed to fast. But what does he say? There are places that have the tradition that if you normally fast on Rosh Hashanah and one year you decide not to fast, so then you will die during that year. That's a very weird thing to say if you think that there's a mitzvah of Simcha and you have to eat. But Shulchan Aruch is clearly saying, look, I don't think you should fast. But there are people who do fast. And if you fast, then you should keep fasting, which almost sounds optional. That, I think, only makes sense if you think that Shulchan Aruch is of the compromise positions. That Rosh Hashanah is not a Yom Simcha, so you don't have, right? Meaning, he's not totally convinced by the Rosh that it's a Yom Simcha and you should be eating and celebrating, because if he was, he would say, I don't care if you normally have a minhag to fast. Don't fast, it's Chag. But instead he says, look, I don't think you should fast because you're supposed to celebrate, but you should eat a little bit less. And if it's your custom to fast, well, then you might not want to stop fasting because that might be disastrous, right? And I think that hesitation is because he's taking a hybrid position. And therefore he says, the joy of Rosh Hashanah is mitigated. And since it's mitigated, so the other elements of fear, of trepidation, of Yom Hadin, they can sort of come in different ways. Either by saying don't eat too much, or by saying if you have the minhag, so fine, go ahead and fast. And then he gets into Tanit Chalom, which I don't want to get into. So that's why I tend to think that the smoothest way to read the Shulchan Aruch is that this is actually a conceptual continuation, not of the Rosh, but of Rav Nachshon Gaon, of Rav Natranai, of saying, no, yes, there is joy in Rosh Hashanah, but it's not Simcha, it's not a Chag, it's a Moed. And therefore there's room for joy, but there's also room for finding ways of tempering that joy to be true to all the complicated themes that manifest themselves on Rosh Hashanah. Okay, we have one more minute. Okay. You know what? Tomorrow maybe we'll spend 10 more minutes on this, but you don't have to I'll give you new Makarat for a different sugya, but I do want to try to wrap up. Some of these, I would go 5 more minutes, except I'm giving the next shir, so, you know what? It's probably better if I just, I don't know. What do you guys think? Should we stop now and we'll wrap up, not rushing, tomorrow, and then I'll give you Makar for something else?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So if you want tomorrow, you can look at the Magen Avram, and you'll see that the Magen Avram bases himself on a weird Kabbalistic passage from Magid Mesharim. Now, who actually wrote Magid Mesharim? Rabbi Yosef Karo, the same person who wrote Shulchan Aruch. He also wrote a Kabbalistic work, Magid Mesharim. So the Magen Avram presents one position, and you'll see that in the poskim, they toy with whether the conclusion of Shulchan Aruch is that there's Simcha or not, which will take these two last positions and flesh them out. If you want, you can read those inside. If not, then you can move on, I guess, to the next thing, which I think is Rosh Hashanah when it falls on Shabbat, and the sugya is Im Zachor Li Nachon Rosh Hashanah Daf Chavtet Amud Bet. But I'll send it to you. I'll send it in the chat, the exact passage in the Gemara, and start thinking about that Gemara. Okay.